and in an act of neutrality, she decided she was going to support Partick Thistle. So neither Glasgow nor neither Rangers nor Celtic. So I think we all know Laura. Come on up, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And the fact of supporting Partick Thistle, which this year, as indeed for my whole lifetime, has been about a battle against relegation, did, however, as you suggested, have the advantage in growing up in Glasgow of neither being blue or green, which obviously in my job now has the huge advantage of neither having been Leave or Remain, in fact studiously down the middle. But maybe we will talk about that some more after that question to Gina. Anyway, thank you very much indeed for having me. It's very nice to be at home. Edinburgh was my home for a while, to my student self, and where I had my first proper go at broadcasting. But I'm very happy to say that the technology of the late 90s and early 2000s mean that I'm pretty sure there's no evidence of those halting appearances on local radio, or even, dare I say it, cable television on a couple of occasions, having to do the weather as a last-minute stand-in. So let's move on from that very quickly. But that seems a very long time ago for me, both in terms of my own personal progress and experience, but also in terms of the political world that we all lived in then, which, guess what I'm going to talk to you about for the next 20 minutes or so, is the political state that we're in. Because during that time, when I voted for the first time in 1997, and of course I'm never going to tell any of you how I voted then, or indeed how I vote now, but the point for me, as for many of you in this room, is that the 90s and the noughties, basically recent British political history, were times of relative political peace and calm, relative stability. Huge fights, of course, between the Labour neighbours, between number 10 and 11, with mobile phones being thrown at walls and all sorts of things. The Conservatives fighting with each other over, Europe, yes. But broadly, politics was quite predictable, and major events only came along every now and again. Well, now they come along just about as often as the bus. There's been a major British political event every 12 months. 2014, there was the Scottish independence referendum. 2015, there was a general election. In 2016, the European referendum, of course. And in 2017, Theresa May went on a walking holiday in Wales, and we ended up with another general election. In 2018, do we quite know what will have happened by the end of the year? Absolutely not. But what we can say is that we're in a period of time where, whatever the public thinks, we have been dealing with a sort of conveyor belt of huge political events, and that fact alone is not what we've been used to in this country. And of course, that has generated a sense of turbulence and what some people would see as a sense of chaos. And if we think about what is actually happening now in government, sometimes it does feel, frankly, a bit chaotic. Sometimes it does feel like all kinds of things are going on, the government's not really in control. But just before we talk about that in some more detail, I think it is worth, for a few moments, just trying to go back a bit and understanding why we are now in the moment that we're in. The government carrying on, frankly, without much enthusiasm, both of the main Westminster parties divided, and the electorate probably quite grumpy, wishing that the politicians would get on with it and leave them alone for a while. Voters who frankly wish that Westminster would just pack it in for a bit, and probably not see quite so much of me on their TV screens either. Having said that they wouldn't have an election, the Conservatives did. And then they chose a campaign that day after day warned voters there would be chaos if they dared vote for a different party. Strong and stable, remember that, versus coalition of chaos. And they thought that was going to see them home. I remember very well in the closing days of the campaign at a Theresa May rally, you know, the sort of local activists have been bussed in to hold up signs and to cheer her. And a senior minister who was there whispered to me at the back of the room, "Oh, we're on for something pretty comfortable." I mean, they never thought they were going to get anything like 100 seats. But he said, "We're on for something pretty comfortable, or our voters are being deceitful." That was the way that he phrased it. And on the day of the election itself, multiple conversations with Labour and Tory politicians and SNP and Lib Dems all told pretty much the same story. The evidence they were hearing on the ground pointed to a clear Tory win. Labour MPs talked about being battered outside London. During the campaign, I remember one senior Labour figure saying to me, "It's going to be a car crash, we have to grit our teeth and watch it." Well, what actually happened? Well, not what any of them expected. During the campaign, the energy and passion grew on the side of those who didn't think they had a real chance at the start. A more motivated group of campaigners who saw themselves as the outsiders did more on the ground to get voters excited, and many people were delighted by the chance of at least having a go at unpicking the status quo. Does that sound familiar? Could I have read out those few sentences to analyse almost exactly the same as what happened in the referendum in 2016? What the atmosphere in politics now, of course, obscures completely is that Theresa May was technically the winner. The Tories had more seats and more votes and increased their overall share. And a remarkable truth in the statistics is that if only 50 people had voted Conservative rather than for their constituencies winning the party, in only 4 seats, the Tories would have ended up with a majority. Now that seems unbelievable, but it's true. 50 extra votes in just 4 key constituencies, and the Conservatives would have ended up with an actual majority. Our politics changed overnight because those 200 people in those seats did something else. But it just shows you how exciting elections are for journalists, and actually how closely balanced things can be. Now, it probably already feels like about 100 years ago, the general election. It certainly feels like another lifetime to me. But to understand where we might go with Brexit and what might happen for the country, you have to, I think, try to unpick a little bit of what really happened then. Were those voters deceiving the Conservatives all along, as that minister thought that morning? Well, it was a very complicated set of circumstances. Lots of different issues raised. It wasn't just about Brexit. It wasn't just about Theresa May. It wasn't just about Jeremy Corbyn. The Tories started off thinking that they would romp home pretty comfortably. And MPs from both of the main parties had that reinforced on the doorstep time and time again. And at the beginning of the campaign, so did we as journalists. I remember very distinctly, it's one of the brilliant things about the campaign, we actually get out on the road, we spend much more time around the country than being in the gilded cage of Westminster. And I remember being in Wales in a traditional Labour seat, talking to a lovely man in his late 80s, and we were chatting to him and his son. Had voted Labour all of his life. And I just said, what do you think is going to happen? What are you interested in? And he just said, bye-bye, Corbyn. In this lovely, kind of charming, he just had a lovely manner. He was a lovely old gentleman. But the fact that in that seat, in that place that had been a Labour seat for such a long time, Carwyn Jones' backyard, at the beginning of the campaign, there was a sense that it could have been a rout. And at the start of the campaign, voters weren't telling porky pies to canvassers. What happened, even though after a couple of decades we'd all been told that campaigns don't make a difference, the campaign made a huge difference. The Tories weren't prepared. Theresa fluffed the advantage of political surprise, not just by telling the country at the last minute, but also telling her team in Tory HQ only at the last minute. They should have had first mover advantage, as it might be called in business. But they fluffed it because she didn't tell anyone else. So they were taken aback by the fact they were suddenly going to have to run a campaign. In their individual constituencies, therefore, all MPs couldn't do very much more than go and knock on the doors of what's called promises in elections. People they already knew about, people whose details they already had, people whose votes they already felt they could normally secure. The point is, both main parties' predictions went haywire because on the ground they were talking to voters that they already knew. They didn't therefore pick up what was happening with the people who were going to come back into the electorate, having not bothered to vote for a while, or indeed some of those younger people who went out and voted for the first time. And just as in the referendum, we saw was that people who had previously considered the whole thing a boring waste of time, or who weren't old enough to take part, saw this election as their moment, a time when it mattered, a time when their priorities and their problems might be being listened to by someone for once. And the political managerial class, those career politicians that Gina was talking about, weren't the only ones on the pitch. And everybody saw the response to Jeremy Corbyn on the ground at rallies around the country, a politician who people like and are drawn to because he doesn't look like the rest of them. One senior minister now believes, and told me with much frustration, no one picked up the surge in young people to their eternal frustration. They said, people are always fighting the election we've just had. We should have known after the referendum, they said, that this was the election where younger people would be switched on. And there's no question that Labour saw much more opportunity in that, and in particularly went after those newer votes with technology in a much more effective way. We know now from the numbers that there wasn't a youth quake. It's not as simple as suddenly millions of students decided to vote for the first time and they all voted Labour. But with voters under 40, the energy around the Labour campaign, which looked and felt different, really had a very strong appeal. And as the weeks went on through that campaign, it felt the Conservative campaign was becoming more brittle, more controlled. Theresa May even allowing herself to eat a chip in front of the camera felt like a massive act of rebellion. And the taut atmosphere around her sort of crackled in the air. She didn't look like she was enjoying the campaign. And frankly, if she didn't look like she was enjoying it, why would anybody else feel enthusiastic about what she was trying to offer to the public? And those hoped-for, strong and stable moments morphed into accusations that she was a robot, unable to respond to changing situations, unable to emote. Now, in terms of people being able to perform on a campaign, it may or may not be fair as a measure of whether or not somebody would actually be an effective Prime Minister. But politics is hugely about communication. Of course it is. And on the other side, Jeremy Corbyn looked like he was having fun. He draws his energy from crowds. He looked like he was enjoying every moment. And he started to look like someone who could be a winner. Now, in those volatile days, as there always is, there are all sorts of attempts to reach sweeping conclusions about the election and the referendum, about people were trying to say, the vote was about this, the vote was about that. People, it was the Remainers' revenge. Oh, it was all about Theresa May looking like a robot. Well, of course, we are all different. It's not that simple. People vote for all sorts of gloriously tangled up reasons. Of course, here in Scotland, there was almost a completely different question on the ballot paper. For many voters in Scotland, it was a straightforward constitutional question. Do you want to have another independence referendum or not? And of course, in other parts of the country, there were different local factors that were parts of the discussion, in a way that in our sort of Westminster-based reporting or the national parties and the national campaigns can never really hope to capture. Labour didn't collapse in Scotland, which lots of people had predicted. UKIP pretty much did melt away, which looked likely, but we didn't really know the extent to which that would happen. And since the referendum, UKIP has sort of struggled to find a reason for being, and reports this week even that they're going to try to have a whip round among their members at a meeting that's coming up in order actually to stay afloat. I'm sure that donations from anybody here in this room would be very welcome, if unlikely. But what we saw was that Brexit motivated different voters in different ways. In some places, Labour was able to reach out to new voters or returning voters. The Lib Dems melted away. And for millions of voters, different day-to-day considerations made their minds up. And the Tories' main calculation that this campaign was all about leadership proved to be a mistake. So we know then a little bit, a whistle-stop tour, if you like, of why we are in the predicament we are now in, under a minority government where the country is politically unstable in that sense, in a way that it hasn't been for a long time. This week, Number 10 is more chipper than they've been for quite some time. But they can't escape from, and they're well aware of the fact that the general election humbled the Prime Minister and it weakened her authority. leaving Theresa May a wounded antelope, as one of her senior colleagues so kindly describes her. She had to face off a coup attempt in October, of course. I'm not going to start coughing, that would be cruel. There may well be another attempt after the local elections if there is a Tory wipeout, which some people predict. But the biggest question, of course, for the country and for you in this room, I'm sure, is what does this mean for Brexit? What happens in the next stage of these fraught negotiations? And what happens, does it make a difference if the negotiations are being carried out by a leader who has seen some of their authority drain away? And what happens, frankly, when there are people around the cabinet table who are sitting there thinking that they could do a better job than their leader, even though none of them have the guts or the nerve right now to say so in public? Well, Theresa May would probably say nothing has changed. But there does seem to be, sometimes, what appears to be daily chaos. Brexiteers campaigning against the Chancellor, on the quiet, not that quiet. Remainers horrified by the fact that some Brexiteers are campaigning against the Chancellor, not very quietly. And Brexiteers rubbing their hands with glee at being able to exert control over the Prime Minister because she needs their numbers. But beneath all of that is the reality of life with no parliamentary majority and a very tight situation in the public finances. And more worrying for the Conservative Party in a bigger sense is the problems of the future. There is a huge debate just starting in the Conservative Party about who they want to be, what they want to represent, what are they really for when in only just more than 12 months' time we will, unless something strange happens, be outside the European Union. But there are, and there will probably be, for the rest of this intense period, some things that the Tory party can agree on, even over Brexit. They agree, more than anything else, they do not want to have a general election at the moment because they all worry about losing their jobs. They do now agree that on leaving the European Union that there has to be a period of implementation, a transition phase. They didn't agree that 12 months ago. They agree now that we'll have to pay a significant amount of money, tens of billions, in order to settle our accounts and in order to pay for some kind of access in the 2 years after we leave. Even though they had to endure each other's company at an away day in Chequers. They did also manage to agree a limited set of objectives. An agreement that may well be completely picked apart by our opponents opposite the negotiating table in Brussels. But the government did, against some expectation a few months ago, manage to agree a broad opening offer. Now, there are still real contradictions, real tensions inside the government's position, of course. No magic answer to the Irish border question, for example. But I'm sure you will have seen the Prime Minister's speech last week at the Mansion House, and it did represent a political step forward, most importantly with the message that the European Union very much wanted to hear, is that Theresa May admitted she can't have it all. Britain will have to compromise. We will not have to use the appallingly overused metaphor of which I'm guilty of milking myself. Having our cake and eat it is not on the menu. Now, the EU responded this week inevitably with the usual headlines. A hangdog, it's going to be worse, there will be a negative impact, you can't cherry pick, you can't have everything. But it does feel to me now that we are now at the point where there can be a real conversation between the two sides about our future relationship. Many people may wonder, of course, why is that only really starting to happen now? But it does appear that we are now moving into a genuine phase of negotiation over the future relationship. Now, don't be so naive, and I'm sure none of you in this room would be, to imagine that a clear path to something that looks like certain success has suddenly opened up. The government is still at odds with itself over the level of cooperation between the UK and the EU after the implementation period. They have agreed what they can for now. The question, of course, will be, can they stick together when the negotiations get rough? If, and more likely when, there's a significant pushback from the EU 27 and the UK actually has to start making those compromises that Theresa May has warned of. And it is still true, there is a real, probably not large, but a real possibility that the talks could break down. And it is also true that for some Brexiteers, it remains the case that they believe a swifter exit with no deal is preferable to a sort of drawn-out agony and a permanent sort of stasis with the European Union, with talks that go on and on and on and on. Of course, on the other side, there's a deep anxiety among Remainers and huge uncertainty for business about the prospects for a deal. But I think it's also important to remember, without sounding like Pollyanna or believing in rainbows and unicorns, that both on the UK side and the EU, no one is actually planning for or hoping for any kind of Armageddon. No one is deliberately trying to make the process break down. Of course, it's an asymmetric battle, 27 of them, one of us. But there's no desire on either side really to bust up the process, to pummel the opponents into the dust, or to create some chaos. And whether it's the ongoing Brexit saga, the backwash of the election, the uncertainties of life under a minority government, whether it feels like it to you or not, no politician is trying to cause chaos either. And as much as they are pilloried, sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly, what they are trying to do is respond to the best of their abilities within the constraints of their politics, to the instructions of the people, whether at the referendum or the general election. Politicians make plenty of mistakes. They're sometimes vain, they're sometimes ridiculous, but they're trying to respond to what the general public decide. They have no choice in that. And as people's lives change faster than before, technology changes the nature of work and communication. We're seeing that play out in politics. Demographic moves create new pressure points and clashes. The demands on politics change. And if you stand back, is it fair to say it's somehow chaotic? It's all over the place, the government doesn't know what they're doing? Or is it politicians having to respond to a world that's changing very, very quickly? If you stand back, maybe it's no surprise that after the crash, the never-ending triangulation of centre-ground politics, who try to be all things to all people, maybe it's no surprise that that's hit the buffers. And stand back. Maybe it's no surprise that new mass ranks of young people coming into the electorate didn't much fancy a sort of home counties flavour of conservatism. And if you stand back, it's no real surprise that the real challenges of people's lives mean that politicians have to look for solutions for them outside their own comfort zone, and having to choose to follow paths that they might not have decided to do. It's one of the strangest things about this moment is that we have the Prime Minister pursuing a policy, the main project of her government, that she didn't back. It's a very peculiar moment that we're in, but she is following the instructions of the people. Because I think we sometimes forget our politics are the product of what the country chooses. A referendum that was called to try to end the years of division in one political party ended up with an unexpected instruction from the public to Westminster. An election that was called by a politician who wanted to show who's in charge ends up again with politicians having been reminded most strikingly of the biggest and most fundamental thing in politics, that people can forget it, people can ignore it, but they will always in the end be rudely reminded that it is the public, not anybody who inhabits the world of Westminster, who is really and always the boss. I'm going to take some questions.
Thank you. Okay, so start thinking about your questions again. Going to take them in the old-fashioned way or on the app. But let's head off that first one first of all, or the one we finished off with Gina.
Oh,
are you
great.
biased?
Of course not.
As if you were going to answer anything else. So tell us how you control that.
I think the first thing to say is that I think people, quite understandably, nobody really knows the inside guts of anybody else's organisation. So the first thing I would say is that at the BBC, we work so hard to make sure that as much as we can, we are absolutely not displaying bias or partiality, and that we are as balanced as we possibly can be. And there are, I think, there are all sorts of rules and regulations and handbooks of editorial guidelines and all of those kinds of things. But for me, the most important thing is that we are first off, we all care about it massively, because it's why we're there. It's the justification, it's our reason for being. Second of all, we're kind of, me and my colleagues who do similar jobs, we're kind of in a constant conversation with each other all the time about where we're at. Like, is this, are we kind of in the right place? This feels this way, this feels this way. Are we kind of, so I suppose there's a constant kind of self-checking. And, in this moment, in a time of sort of identity politics where people feel hugely strongly on both sides, of course we get it in the neck from both sides. But the important part of that sentence is we get it from both sides. And we're not there to represent either side. We're there, and I'm there for the people who are watching at home who might have a side or they might not have a side, but the people kind of in the mid, the people who are sort of in the middle, and we take it extremely seriously. Can you please all the people all the time? Of course you can't. We'd be naive to think that we could.
What about that accusation? And Gina mentioned it towards the end there, and it was in The Guardian as well last weekend. A huge amount of airtime that Nigel Farage is getting, even on Question Time right now. Well,
Nigel Farage, I think I had, until he was on Question Time last week, and I actually can't remember the exact detail of this week. I don't think actually he'd been on Question Time since 2017 sometime, but because people who don't like him feel so strongly about him being on telly, that has created this sort of thing. I mean, there is actually a formula, believe it or not, for deciding how often, in a campaign period, deciding how often political parties are represented. And it's based on their vote share in recent elections and all sorts of things. So look, lots of people might not like it, clearly from how people express themselves sometimes, some people might not like it, but in the one set of European elections relatively recently, UKIP, I think, had 4 million votes. I mean, at one point, they were a huge political force. So if we hadn't had their representatives on air, that would have been, that would have been completely wrong. And it's all very sort of carefully worked out. Now, of course, when people take against someone, they don't like seeing them on air. Okay. But, we, as I said, we're not there to try to please either side.
Okay. Okay. Anyone out there? Don't be shy. Okay, so we're going to start with this chap over here, and then we'll go to there's somebody over there as well.
Laura, it's Clifford Sims from Squire Patton Boggs. How long can Theresa last?
I think it's really, you can see lots of different scenarios. Okay, so there is a possibility that if there's a complete disaster in the May elections, that enough Tory MPs could decide, actually, this is it, this is enough, and they could trigger a leadership contest. The same could happen after the Brexit deal in October, after we get the heads of terms. There might be a sentiment that that it's such a terrible deal that she must go. You can also see a feasible scenario where actually she manages to tough it out until the end of the Brexit process, or even, I mean, some people in Number 10 believe that she might actually be able to fight a general election. Now, when you ask most Tory MPs about that, they do what you've just done, Sarah, and roll your eyes. But I think one of the fascinating things about this moment is that there are many, many scenarios which are all quite probable. And it felt, and the main reason actually for her surviving thus far is that had there been any one person that the Tory party could agree on who would be able to do a better job and keep the party together, she would have been out on the morning of June the 9th. And they can't, and that one person doesn't seem to be anywhere. And also, to add to that, the young bucks, not all bucks, but mainly bucks, don't want to be tainted by any of the potential Brexit mess or move to glory, right? The next generation want this parked before they can then come through and say, aha, hello Britain, it's my turn now. So there's a kind of there's a big generational tension in the Tory party, huge. But none of the potential challengers really who are in that second generation want to sort of get all messed up in Brexit. And as one minister delightfully expressed it to me, that's such a charming turn of words sometimes, that Theresa is the skip and all of the Brexit mess is being taken out the house and chucked in there, and then when it's done, they'll come and pick the skip up, take it away, and then we start again.
It's a very eloquent summary, isn't
lovely,
it?
Isn't it? The other way is someone said, why would we not, no one else wants this on their shoulders. Oh.
Yeah, we'll stick with the skip. So we're going to go to that chap at the back there next, and then there was a question down the front after that one, please. So number 4.
Thanks very much, Horner, Warwickshire. The previous speaker sort of raised the question in my mind, but people talk about Brexit and the leavers as not really knowing what they voted for and this sort of thing. But I was trying to work out what Remainers want. Did they mean, I mean, in the referendum, it was David Cameron's renegotiation we were voting to accept or leave.
Yes, which he said hardly a single word about during the campaign.
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't use the renegotiation as a tool in the campaign at all because they didn't get as much as they wanted, and they understood, I think rightly, that the renegotiation was seen in Brussels as having all sorts of interesting big concessions. But they weren't things that would cut through to the public, really. Say, oh, ever closer union, the UK won't be part of ever closer union. Well, you know, for most of us, what does that mean? Is that a tangible thing that feels like it will make a difference to our lives? Probably, you know, probably not. I think on both sides, people voted on all sorts of different things for all sorts of different reasons. And I always kind of push against people trying to categorize those voters did that because of that. And I think on both sides, it was really, really complicated. And I also think on the Remain side, one of the people who were involved in it would now say that one of the frustrations and one of the mistakes they believe they made is that it was a very, very, you know, it was Project Fear Mark 3, right? Project Fear 3.0. It was the kind of, if you dare do this, you know, a plague of locusts will arrive on your house, and you know, and your house prices will drop the next day by 18%. And they didn't let in any of the identity questions about who we are, who you feel you are as a country. And there was a lot of pressure. For example, there was the central Remain campaign wanted there to be a big sort of moment, a big speech about immigration, making the case for immigration. And Osborne and Cameron basically wouldn't let it happen. We just don't want to get into that. They kept on the narrow focus, economic focus, because their belief was, and I remember somebody senior on the campaign saying to me, the British public are not going to do what they haven't done for 100 years and vote against their economic self-interest. That was their really simple analysis. People vote on their wallet, and they're being told that their wallet will hurt if they dare vote for Brexit. Well, people did something else. And they did vote that way. But I think it's very complicated. But you're right. I mean, Remain never articulated really what the benefits were. They said the world will, you know, actually apart from Theresa May, a lot of people in the Remain campaign sort of said the world will end if you dare vote to leave. And it didn't work with the electorate, you know, because people have heard it before. And if you think of the crash, as we were touching on before, you know, people didn't have trust in people who are telling them things about the economy because it had gone so badly wrong before.
Go down to the front there, and then the chap at the back afterwards. Sorry, I'm keeping you
running
around.
A bit shorter.
George Graham, I'm a trustee of the RBS Group Pension Fund. Ian Blackford from the SNP told us earlier this morning that he thought pensions policy ought to be taken away from politicians who'd only tinker with it and given to an independent commission. It sounds a bit like the Boston Strangler saying, "Stop me before I kill again." Why do you think politicians no longer have the competence, or is it the skill or the integrity, to take on difficult, long-term, effective policy making? Or did they never have it?
I don't think it's that they don't. I think, for example, right now you've got a government that doesn't have a majority. So they don't have the political capital to do things that might be very difficult. And in the election, actually, Theresa May, one of the reasons it kind of went so wrong for her is because she stood up and said, there are lots of big, difficult things that we have to do in this country, like get people to pay a lot more money for social care. And in the political climate that we're in, people didn't vote for that. And if you don't have a big majority, or if you don't have any majority, it's very difficult to do difficult things. And I know often people talk about a commission or a cross-party grouping or whatever. That is, again, hugely difficult when you have the political spectrum once again being so far apart. So, and someone said to me that the idea, for example, of a health commission was potentially a goer, but the Tories don't feel that they would be able to work with Corbyn because they're so far apart. When the parties are closer, then that kind of cross-party or commissions, whatever, probably has got a better bet. But in a sense also, you know, governments have always done commissions and things like that. If you think of something like the Wanless Review or the endless pension reviews that have been done, Dilnot on, or Lord Brown or all sorts of things, but they're still used by politicians as a political tool. So it can be useful to have a commission because you get somebody else to take responsibility for doing the hard stuff. But in the end, as a politician, you've got control of tax and spend and of policy. You have to legislate for what is actually going to be done. But I don't think it's that we're in an era where suddenly politicians are incapable and don't have integrity. I think if you've got a government with no majority, and remember before that we had, coalition, it's really hard. But they did, for example, do auto-enrollment. Right? That was a huge reform that you will all understand far better than I do, and that was a big change, and that was driven through by politicians.
I think part of the problem we've got is there's a tension between DWP, who are looking at the long-term social policy of pension, and then we've got Treasury, who are after getting money into the bank
account.
again.
They want to get money out, right, for sure.
How does that tension work out? I mean,
well, the Treasury is always the boss, right? Basically, the Treasury is always is often overspending departments. The Treasury's
going to be the boss.
Always the boss.
Okay. So one last question at the back there, microphone number 4.
Hi Laura, John T. Graham from Foresight Group. Boris Johnson, are we ever going to see him in number 10?
It's not impossible. Right now it feels very unlikely, but it's not impossible.
Will that make your job more interesting?
Well, it's already pretty interesting, but yeah, I mean, he is... politicians who complain about him, a lot of it is envy, because he is one of the very, very, very small number of politicians that when you are out in public with them on the campaign trail or whatever, everybody wants to go and talk to him. They might hate him, they might love him, but everyone knows who he is, and everyone wants to go and talk to him, and he has that kind of pulling power that most politicians would sell their granny for. And when they say it's all terrible and it's all a disgrace and all the rest, there's quite a large green-eyed quotient that's actually really going on in there. And there's no question he is a very, very effective communicator. And you might love him, hate him, think he's an idiot, think he's a buffoon, whatever. He's a hugely effective communicator with very significant political skills in that vein. Which is why, that's why he's in the government. I mean, for Theresa May, what would have been sensible? Bring him into the tent and he can sort of be, be part of the thing, or do you have him on the back benches causing trouble and still being the face and the voice of Brexit when every time it goes wrong and giving her a really, really hard time? It feels unlikely right now that he would win a leadership contest as and when there is one, because he's not had a great time at the Foreign Office. His stock is quite low. But it's not impossible.
So I'm just going to change the subject with the last question. So we've talked about diversity over the course of the last few days.
Yeah, I was entertained by your...
Sorry about that. I'm working very hard. And we had Anne Richards, who runs M&G, yesterday talking about the gender difference within her firm.
Yes.
A number of people have asked the question. In fact, you used the phrase at one point, me and my colleagues who do similar jobs.
Oh, I was really looking forward to this question.
Yeah.
But you'll notice that I've studiously avoided at any point saying anything publicly about this issue at all.
Okay.
Yes.
And you're not going to do...
Well, it depends what the question is.
So...
And then I will decide.
Do you get paid as much as your male colleagues, and should you? And what are you going to do about it if you're not?
Well, I'm not going to answer a specific question about my own specific remuneration, because I think gender pay is a political issue. And as we close where we began, the most important thing to me in my job is being impartial, and therefore for me to make a comment on a political question, I think would be wrong. What I would say is, look, clearly this stuff is all moving in one direction. Not to quote the boy band, but clearly disclosure is becoming more and more the norm. Clearly it is harder and harder for people to justify there being big differences. I was not, people will have read themselves in the papers, I was not one of the people who was sort of suddenly revealed as being massively out of kilter. But I'm not going to get into that. But I think it's moving in one place. And I know there are a lot of city firms and law firms who in the next little while are going to be putting their stuff out, which isn't going to look so pretty, I don't think.
It's the beginning of a journey. Okay, so that's all we've got time for with Laura. So if we say thank you first of all to Laura. That was really good. Thank you.